Okay, the next step in building my Viking box project is I need to cut a dado through the board. And a dado is just a groove through the board somewhere in the middle, not on the end, but somewhere through the center. And notice that when I cut a dado, I'm not cutting all the way through the board, and that's an important distinction to make because this table saw where we do all our dados and rabbets and the table saw where we do our rip cuts have different guard systems like we pointed out before, and that's really important. Notice that this guard, I can pass completely under it, but there's no splitter, there's no kickback protector, and for that reason, students are never to attempt to make rip cuts on this table saw. They're always to use the one with the other guard. At least did that at the beginning of class. So, the way we make our dados, we have a system of blades, and in our shop we use what's called a stacked dado head system. And what that is it's a series of blades that we add and subtract and stack together to make different widths of cuts. And this system is not intended to be used to cut clear through a board, only grooves through a board. Right now it's set up for a 1/4 inch dado, and it's set up at a 1/4 inch dado because it has 2 blades. Each of the blade components in our stacked dado head system are 1/8 of an inch. These are the 2 outside blades. And then we have a series of filler blades called chippers. All of them also measure 1/8 of an inch, except for one special one, which is a 1/16. And by adding and subtracting these measurements, we can cut different widths of dados and rabbets. So my first one is a 1/4 inch dado. So I have my 2 1/8 inch blades, outside blades, and I look on the plan for my Viking box and it tells me that I want a dado 1 3/4 inch from the edge. Well, this time instead of using the measurement tape on the fence, I'm going to use my tape measure because once I start adding pieces to this dado blade, it throws this tape measure off and it's no longer accurate. So I measure over 1 3/4 inch, right to the edge of the blade. And I'm going to dado all 4 pieces of my project. So I want to look at the pieces and I want to decide, well, what do I want showing on the outside and what do I want to put on the inside? Because whatever I put down, that's going to go into the inside of the box. The other thing I want to keep in mind, at least on this project, is that whatever I put against the fence is going to be the bottom of the project. So sometimes that matters according to the grain that a student might have on the project, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm going to dado all 4 pieces to look like this one. Well, as I start to teach about this particular cut, I like to point out that I contradict myself quite a bit. The rules, in a lot of respects, are opposite from what they were on the other table saw guard system. Over on the other system, if I was going to send something through the blade, so I've got my push stick, I've got my 4-inch rule, I'm holding it against the fence, and on the other system I would then take this hand away. Well, if I do that when I'm making a dado, if I release pressure on the board, because I'm not cutting all the way through the board, there's nothing to keep the board against the fence, so it goes spitting out the side, and we've saved some samples of that happening. So it's important when I do the dado that I keep pressure against the fence all the way through the cut. Well, if I'm going to meet the 4-inch rule, there's no way I can keep my hand here. So when I do get here, I'm going to have a matching board. So I'll use my matching board to keep it tight against the fence. That'll keep my hand forward just from the line and cut. And then my push stick will run it through. Notice my push stick is running between the guard and the fence. And I still want to stand beside just like I did on my rip cut. But just like the jointer, another board becomes a push stick. So I turn this on, I wait for a solid green. Oh, and incidentally, I need to set the height of the board, or the height of the blade for the depth of my dado. The height of this blade corresponds to how deep this dado is. And in this particular project, I want the dado to be about 1/4 inch deep. So what I do is I use a 1/4 inch piece of material, this MDF, which we're going to later use for the floor of our box. And I just get it so that the top swing of the blade is pretty much even with it. It's actually a little high. And that looks pretty good. Now I'm ready to run it. Push stick on the board. Use the other board as the second push stick. I'm going to keep pressure all the way through the cut. So when I reach for it, I reach around it. I do not reach under the guard. I reach around it and bring the piece back around. And then I'm going to send it again just to be sure that I got it all. So there's that one. Now I'm going to do the other. All the way through. And one of the reasons I make 2 passes is this blade is hitting the board from underneath and it wants to lift it and send it back. So sometimes the board has a tendency to float up a little bit, which is why I need to hold it down, and also why I'm going to make 2 passes. All the way through.
Can you repeat why you send it twice?
We always send it through twice, especially when it's wood and not MDF, because the blade's hitting it from underneath and it has a tendency to want to lift the board or have it float. So that's why we think it's important to make 2 passes, just to make sure the cut's complete. You don't want to find out later when you're trying to assemble it that you got a big lump inside the dado because you didn't completely cut it. That can be a mess when you've got glue everywhere. So that's how I make my dados for the Viking box. And then I'm going to change the blade zone. I'm going to move the guard out, pull the throat plate off. And one of the things I really like, I turn it off here. One of the things I really like about the saw stop table saws when we got them is that they have a 2-wrench system. I don't have to wedge the blade with a block of wood. I've got the 2 wrenches. Just loosen it up. Take the nut off. Be careful not to drop it down into the chute. Take off the arbor washer. And I'm going to remove the blade. So one point I like to make here is that these are the outside blades of my stacked dado head system, and there's certain rules to using it. And like I mentioned before, I can add and subtract components to increase or decrease the thickness of the cut. But the way that this is set up, the way this is set up is part of every equation is always going to be the 2 outside blades. I would never ever use like an outside blade and 1 chipper. Always the 2 outside blades. And I tell students that it's like making a sandwich, and we don't make any open face sandwiches. The 2 outside blades are the bread, the chippers are the meat and cheese. So I'm ready to set up, this time I'm going to set up a 5/8 wide rabbet. And I look at my dado blades, and I can still read some of the writing on them. This one says this side out. And I know that the teeth are always going to point towards me on the table saw. But after I get these blades sharpened a few more times, I'm not going to be able to read this side out. And then how do I know which one goes on first? Because there is a right way and a wrong way. Well, if I point the teeth towards me and I look at the blades, I can see that they're cut at a bevel. There's a high point and a low point, and they're opposite. So I want to take the blade that's higher to the left and put that one on first with the teeth pointing towards me. And I also want to note that it's missing a tooth. And the blade missing a tooth because that's where my first chipper is going to go. The carbide teeth on these blades and these chippers are a little wider than the body of the blade and the chipper. So it's important that I not have two teeth right next to each other. I want to offset them, and that's what that gap's for. So teeth pointing towards me, I put that on. And this particular rabbet is going to be 5/8 of an inch wide, which means if each piece is an 1/8 inch, I need 5 total pieces. And if I need 2 outside blades, that means I need 3 chippers. So I want the chipper teeth pointing towards me also. And incidentally, one of the big rules in our shop with this is even if you're the one that sets this up, and that doesn't happen very often in woodwork, but it happens later potentially, even if you are the most outstanding woodworking student we have, you would never run this dado setup without having a teacher check it first. So I put my outside blade on, I put my first chipper on next to the gap in the first blade. I staggered the second one because I don't want to bunch them together. There's the third chipper, and then when I put the last blade on, I put the missing tooth part next to the last chipper. Well, now I'm ready to put the nut back on, but one thing that's different this time is I'm not going to use the arbor washer. And I'm not going to use the arbor washer because I've made this blade 5/8 of an inch wide, which means I can't get the arbor washer on and the nut and have the nut completely threaded on. And in this case, it's more important to have the nut completely threaded on. So I use the arbor washer when I can because it stabilizes the blade. But if I have to choose, well, it's more important to use the nut all the way on. I tighten it up, doesn't have to be super tight. And I like to point out too at this point that there are different types of throat plates on our saws. These are for the standard cuts, and the ones with the wider curves are for the dados and rabbets. So there's my 5/8 blade sticking up there. And incidentally, here's the brake cartridge for the 10-inch blade. We have a separate brake cartridge just for the dado because the dado is only 8 inches in diameter and our standard saw blades are 10 inches in diameter. So if I was to put this standard saw blade on, which we do from time to time, I would need to change my brake cartridge as well. They're not interchangeable. In fact, the saw wouldn't work if I didn't do that. So, I bring the fence over. And a lot of times this is where even shop teachers can have a difference of opinion as far as the best way to do things. And I believe that we have best control of this rabbet when the blade is close to the fence and our hands are further away. And the danger here, obviously, is that I can cut into my fence. Well, I can address that by putting a sacrifice fence on to protect it. I'm not doing it right now. But what I am doing is I'm looking down and the fence is locked in, and I'm making sure that the blade is not touching the fence. In fact, I like to have like a full 1/16 away, and you'll see the result of that when I run the rabbet. So I've got the fence set up. I don't have to set the height because it's going to be the same as the dado. I'm going to bring the guard over. Lock it in. And now I'm going to break a rule that I laid down over on the other saw. I'm going to use the miter gauge and the fence on opposite sides of the blade, which is exactly what I told you not to do on the other saw. Well, again, it's because the guards are different, and I'm not cutting clear through the board. And it's my experience, in my opinion anyway, that this is much more stable and much safer. You'll notice that on this particular miter gauge we put an extension fence on it. We've colored in red. You can guess what that means. That's a no-fly zone. Don't get your fingers anywhere near that. And the challenge here is to be able to hold the board down, back against the miter gauge, and in against the fence all at once, all three motions, with the most important one being the down and the back against the miter gauge. When we build our Viking box, we're only going to rabbet the two sides. Turn the saw on so it can go through its systems check. See if I did everything right when I put it back together. And it's ready to go. One other thing I want to point out is that any cut you do in this shop, but especially this one, nothing is gained by speed. The slower you go, especially on this initial pass, the cleaner your cut's going to be and the safer your cut's going to be. So again, I've got to get good control of the board before I run it. And when I do my safety sign-offs later with the students, I'll actually stand here and I'll ask them before they turn on the saw, show me, find your grip. Show me that you have control of it. I like to spread my fingers out a bit like this. Other people like to do this. I've seen some prefer this. Again, as long as it's effective and safe, whatever your comfort level is with the size of your hand and the cut you're making. So I turn that on, nice and slow, I make that rabbit. And the slower I go, the better quality my cut here on the cheek of the cut. When I talk about the blade floating, it's especially true here. All that big wide blade hitting it from underneath wants to lift it, so I have to be sure I'm holding it down firmly. Nice and easy. So I made my two passes. My cut's complete. But I have this little chunk left over, and that represents how far away that blade is from the fence. And that's a good thing on my Viking box project. I don't want too much, but that's going to help me later. But I do want to get rid of it. So I put it back against the fence, and then I'm going to just pull it away about a 1/4 inch. And I'll run it through the blade one more time, just to clean it up and remove it. So I'm going to wrap it. I'm going to rabbet both ends of my short pieces. There's my cut, and I'm going to clean up what's left. Pull it away from the fence. That's what that looks like. Now I'm going to clean those off. I think I went right through that presentation and didn't distinguish between a rabbet and a dado. I just started calling it a rabbet. Rabbet's a groove on the end of the board. Dado's a groove through the center of the board. So this is what my 4 pieces look like after they've been planed, jointed, ripped, cross-cut, dadoed, and rabbeted. And I'm well on my way to having my Viking house, or my Viking